Welcome to this Institute seminar. I'm talking today on behalf of the research team about research utilisation and whether in fact the policymakers to whom we direct much of our research are actually paying attention to what we do. And this raises a whole bunch of issues about the nature and quality of the social research that we undertake in a university setting, and about whether government agencies and other organisations are well positioned to notice, to be aware, to make use, to be receptive, and to forge various kinds of relationships with research academics so that a higher level of research utilisation is the outcome. The last 3 years, many of you will know, having heard perhaps earlier versions of this talk, that we've had an ARC linkage with quite a number of government departments, state and federal. The slides that I've distributed have quite a bit of information about the project and the range of partners and so on. I'll skip over that fairly quickly in today's talk in order to focus on some of the results and some of the implications. But I do want to acknowledge Adrian Cherney, who's sitting over here by the door, one of the CIs on the project, and another CI in absentia, Paul Borum, who was taming wild beasts in Africa a few weeks ago and is now on a gastronomic tour of northern Italy. And he said he wasn't coming back for this tour. We also have a large number of the research team here today. Some of them are acknowledged on this slide, but there's quite a few others as well. So the background here is that we've been talking for 20 or 30 years about trying to make the policy process better informed by good evidence. And we all know that that's problematic for all kinds of reasons, but there's a lot of research literature about this, and our project started up as a way of getting to grips with how this applies in the Australian setting. Skipping on quickly, fundamentally we're focusing on the relationships between the research producing sectors, including universities, and research receiving sectors, consumers of good research, including government agencies in particular. And the argument is, of course, that better research should lead to better policy outcomes. That's the kind of rational assumption that we make. We assume that there's a process of enlightenment that goes on between doing good research, knowing how the world works, and particularly knowing about what kinds of levers are going to be most effective to produce the kind of outcomes that are socially agreed or pursued by a government. But the relationships between the research sector and the government sector are very variable and problematic in some respects. I have to say that quite a few of the academics that we talked to in fact rejected the notion that evidence should be used, or their evidence, their research, should be used directly by governments to do things because they thought that they were being co-opted or compromised in some negative way, and that they cherished their independence. So the idea of being more closely enmeshed with a user of their research was not actually attractive to them. But our project is very much about the researchers who want to forge good and productive relationships with consumers of good research, in particular in the government agencies. We found that the relationships and the utilisation rates are quite patchy and variable. In many cases they're weak relationships. In some cases they're a bit more in the middle, and there's a few hotspots where the relationships between the research sector and government agencies was in fact very strong and enduring and greatly valued by both sides. But the general picture is that the bridges between the two sectors are not very well constructed, and there are not many people crossing over them on a daily basis. The academics argue that policymakers tend to ignore their research and they should pay more attention because the research is wonderful, and the policy officials often say that academic research is poorly written or poorly targeted or not directly relevant to the needs of the day, and therefore not helping the policy or the public servants do their job better. And that's primarily what they're interested in. They're not particularly interested in noble causes. They're much more interested in managing my project and can you help me. So what we've been assuming is that the research sector, which is the bottom right-hand sector, the scientific research sector, is only one of several types of expertise that operate in this process. This is the three lenses model where we basically say the research sector can't expect to be the whole of the policy story. We can contribute, but the expertise coming from think tanks, from the public service, from professional managers who run organisations, and the kind of political know-how and ministerial authority that comes in political judgment are all absolutely fundamental and enduring aspects of the policy process. So we need to find better ways of informing and influencing, but we can't expect the process to be science-driven or research-driven. There's a big unfolding story and debate about what we mean by research impacts these days. There's been a couple of years of discussion about whether the ERA system of research quality assessment should be made broader by looking at research influence and impact and outcomes of research. We're not quite sure where that debate's got to because there's been a change of government, and in the last breath of the previous government they were backing away from it at a fairly fast rate. But one of the things we want to develop as a result of this project is having a more nuanced understanding of the different ways in which researchers might expect their work to be noticed and effective and to contribute. So it would be a contribution model rather than a sort of a causal model of how research impacts actually work. And we need to do a lot more analysis and a lot more talking with the practitioners about how all of that would work. Another thing that is under-researched, a research gap, is understanding what policy workers actually do. There's been quite a bit of very interesting constructivist kind of experiential research just lately about who the policy workers are, what they do, what they think. And we want to contribute to this as well. Most of you in this room have a lot of experience on the academic side. Some of you have also had a deep experience elsewhere. But part of the project is to understand a little better how policy-related public servants think of their job, what they actually do on a day-to-day basis, their preferred sources of information, where does university research fit in all of this, the issue of whether they're specialists or generalists. The generalist argument is something that we talk about later perhaps, but it's basically saying that when you're at senior levels in the public service, it's less important to be a content specialist, it's more important to be a good manager and linker and negotiator, and someone with a bit of streetwise political credibility. So we're particularly interested in how public servants think and the circumstances in which they go outside their own agency or their immediate circle of friends to access external expertise. The project, very quickly, we decided to focus on half of the public service, the big spending half to do with human services, which is well over half of most state and federal budgets. We also included central agencies like Premiers or Prime Minister and Cabinet, and information agencies like the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and the Productivity Commission was a bit of a bonus. And one of the reasons for setting up the design in this way is so that we could look to some extent at to what extent central agencies and line departments, or the service delivery agencies and the central agencies, had a different focus or different mode of operation in relation to drawing on expertise. What kind of expertise did they value? Did the university expertise fit anywhere and where? And also whether there were federal and state differences. So we ended up with 21 departments. 39 gave us money, but the others gave us access, which is the more valuable part of this kind of research. And we had 3 states and the Commonwealth, so quite a large proportion of the government sector in Australia, something like 80% of the Australian population represented by those governments. So we're particularly interested in, as I said, what bodies of knowledge are relied on by public servants, how do they access research literature, and to what extent they do so, and does this pattern vary across different kinds of agencies. So we did 2 things. We did surveys of both academics and public servants because we were very keen to see how similar kinds of questions were addressed by the academic researchers on the one hand and by public servants on the other. And secondly, we interviewed a large number of people at senior level within the academic sector and the public service. So we have 4 sets of data, 2 surveys and 2 sets of interviews. We have 225 interviews which are being heroically coded by some very skilled and dedicated people. We've done quite a lot of analysis already of the survey material, and on the back page of the handout there's 10 or 12 articles and reports that have come out of the project so far, and we hope to get 10 or 12 more before we finish. So, let's have a look at some numbers. We're intrigued about whether public servants see themselves as undertaking a kind of a craft approach where you learn on the job, you don't learn through books and through formal instruction. And there's some quite interesting results, we thought. Of the policy-related public servants that we were talking to, this is in the survey, over half of state and federal public servants said they had taken research skills training, and a little less were saying that they had taken policy skills training. Rather larger numbers saying they were learning their skills both in research and in policy analysis on the job. In one sense that's not surprising, but there haven't been any baseline data on this, and I think that's useful to get a feel for the kind of people that we're talking about and the extent to which they have, if you like, an intellectualised view of the work that they are doing. We were very keen to find out their views about who they go to in terms of trusted and valued sources of information. And not surprisingly, both state and federal public servants were saying that they go to their colleagues in their own agency first. This is, again, unsurprising, but there's been no benchmark information about this up until now, so it's probably simply reinforcing what we would expect to be the case. But as you go down the list, you see that university researchers there are just above halfway up the hierarchy. We think that's probably being a bit kind to the university researchers, but interestingly, they're above private consultants and think tanks, and I think that's nice. That we actually have more expert credibility than those groups, and of course the news media. Moving along fairly quickly, we wanted to understand to what extent academic research was perceived as being influential, perceived as being something you pay attention to and maybe use. And the interesting feature of this slide is comparing what the academics thought and what the policy relevant public servants were saying. And basically, the academics have a much rosier view of their importance than do the public servants. And we didn't know what to expect on that one, but this was a fairly systematic finding, and we want to explore that a little more in analysing the interviews that we've done. some of these statements reflect that continuum type notion of different kinds of influence and impact, and whether awareness then generates other more structured and significant forms of impact, and so on and so forth. But we can come back to that if you like. We're interested in whether, in fact, government staff actually read academic material at all. And remember, the people we're talking to here are people who self-selected as policy relevant and research relevant staff. So it's not your front counter staff, it's the core headquarters people who are doing policy briefings and evaluations and tracking what's going on in terms of program development and so forth. This is state and federal numbers, which on the whole are fairly close together. About a fifth of the policy relevant staff said that they receive this material, that they receive it, it's disseminated to them, and they are aware of it. They give themselves high marks for understanding it. They read and understand what they get. But it's noticeable that the other numbers are much, much lower in terms of awareness of what's going on, their active utilisation of the material in the work they do, and so on and so forth. But there's a significant group, a third to a quarter, who seem to be quite dedicated to taking academic research very seriously and doing a fair bit to make use of it in various ways. On the other hand, the last line there about university research has influenced policy changes is a pretty low number. And I think that goes back partly to the definitional issues of what we really mean by influence and impact, and the kind of indirect contributory role of policy ideas in academic research rather than direct and instrumental uses of research. We wanted to explore the issue of time pressures, and I think this is pretty interesting, just giving their impressions about, well, for example, whether they're using business as an excuse to avoid taking academic research seriously. Under what conditions would you explore academic research? There's a bit of a presumption that it's something you do in your spare time, it's a bit of a luxury, it's not the sort of thing where your supervisors encourage you to go off and spend half a day updating yourself because your job is to manage projects and to get stuff done in a timely way. So there's not enough time to read. Yep, more than half of them were saying that. Not enough time or opportunity to build relationships. Again, very significant numbers saying that. Even more interesting, I think, is the issue of whether agencies are seen as having internal processes to help their staff identify and make use of research. The notion of processes within an organisation to translate research into policy relevant forms. This was one of the big issues that we tracked through the last 3 years, the issue of what's the role of research translation and knowledge brokering within departments and in specialised intermediary groups outside departments to help build those relationships. Barriers to research translation. The public servants had a number of interesting views about their relationships with the academics and whose fault it was. Academic researchers are more interested in publishing ivory tower stuff. This is the argument that academics are insular, that their incentives are to publish in university peer-reviewed type journals. There's very little incentive for them to take policy and practitioner audiences very seriously. So that's quite a strong impression among the public servants. And of course, we also asked academics about that, and there's some similar, in fact stronger messages coming from them. A bit of blaming again. Academic researchers don't make enough effort. It's their fault. If I don't know about it, it's probably their fault rather than mine. They're not very good at communicating, and they don't really understand our business. They're not familiar with our processes. So there is a bit of a view that the two sectors don't meet very systematically, and there are a number of reasons, and part of it is because they don't do what would help us have closer relationships with us. What do the academics say? Well, the academics say fairly similar things, actually. The academic reward system does not value or recognise research impacts engagement, at least on the same level. We have interesting debates in this and other universities about where does engagement fit. And if you talk to a promotions committee, they tend to say, well, it's nice that you have these links, but you know, where are the top quality publications? So it's a bit of a hierarchy. Universities want everything, but they value the high quality publications. So that's where effort goes. The requirement to publish in peer-reviewed journals inhibits a focus on policy and practice issues. High costs in time. Collaboration is time-consuming. It takes a lot of effort and persistence, and indeed, it's not a one-off thing. If you develop a network at great personal cost of time and effort, you find that there's so much churning among the network that you have to systematically renew and refresh the network all the time. So there are high costs in doing this. Staff turnover. And there are insufficient intermediary groups like networks and forums to make this happen a lot better. Getting towards the end now, we asked the public servants to say a little bit about how they think the policy process works. And this was a way to some extent of rounding out a picture of not just about where does research fit, but trying to get their impression of what it's like working in a policy relevant part of a government agency. Policy making is driven by budgetary considerations, not by scientific truth. Policy decisions are based on politically acceptable points of view. Well, you would expect that, and that's not necessarily a criticism by the public servants. It's indeed just a traditional affirmation of the difference between ministers set policy directions and public servants do what is necessary to fine-tune that and implement it. The urgent takes precedence over long term. I think that's very important to me and a number of others in this room, I know, but it does say something about the nature of policy projects that are undertaken. They tend to be quick and dirty rather than long and thorough. And the public servants that we talked to, and there were 2,000 in the sample across 21 agencies, a lot of them thought this was a major issue. The time frame is very short. Interestingly, we wanted to pick up the issue of what was changing over time, and a lot of them agreed that my policy-related work increasingly involves working across organisations. This might be part of the saviour or the pathway to better relationships with academics, because within the government sector there's a lot of reflection on the need to work across government and outside government with the NGO sector, with business, with stakeholder groups, and of course the science and research people. Okay, and the media has too much influence. The state public servants thought that more strongly than did the federal, and one assumes that's something to do with the frontline services aspect of state governments, where the local monopoly newspaper puts a lot of pressure on public servants to pay attention to certain issues. And threw this in for just to see what came back. Policy making is crisis driven. About half of the whole sample agreed with that, a bit over half actually. Again, the state level of government was a bit higher on that, and there may be good reasons for that. We were intrigued to find out to what extent digitally based information is drawn on and how the technology revolution has changed the way in which public servants work. And we were not surprised to find that Professor Google is the #1 source of research-related information. That search engines were very highly relied upon to throw up relevant information to go and have a closer look at. A minority of people were familiar with electronic databases that carry academic material, and if their department was not providing them, then not many had the capacity or the time and interest to go and look at this. So there is some genuine issues about how the information infrastructure works, and issues about accessibility were commented on quite a lot. Ooh, what happened then? So, 2 last slides. In general, 3-year project has agreed with a lot of the literature, namely that the research sector and the government sector are rather different. The question for us is mapping that in a little more detail, particularly around mutual expectations and a sense of roles and responsibilities, and particularly around opportunities to do things a bit better. We found that policy-related staff in all departments, at state and federal level, had major reservations about giving high priority to academic research over other forms of expertise. Again, I don't think that's either surprising or alarming. It's more a challenge to see to what extent the current kind of balance of activity is capable of being moved, and what instruments and methods we could use to make that a bit different. I'm not sure whether it's important, but only half the policy-related staff have formal training in policy analysis or statistical analysis, and most of their applied policy skills are learned on the job. This may raise opportunities for us. It may be a niche area where the university sector can step forward and offer to be helpful, not in a condescending way, but in a way that this is showing up as a perceived gap by their own staff, and maybe it's something that they would like to do something about, and by the way, we can help. So there may be some interesting conversations that could occur there. Last slide. Policy staff and the research community attested quite positively to the need for better processes. Remember, we were talking to people who probably had a predisposition to take research and serious information analysis quite seriously, both on the academic side and on the government side. But there was a general recognition that relationships are 90% of the answer. How do you build better relationships? It's not so much about throwing more information into the cyberspace. It's not about direct dissemination. It's not about dropping academic articles from a helicopter in George Street. So it's about relationship building, and a lot of the work going on within the research team, including our research students, is about trying to tease out what some of that relationship building might look like. We have some interesting work going on around research translation, about knowledge brokering, about forms of interaction and connectivity between the sectors, and what forms of connectivity seem to be most valued on both sides and internationally. Because a lot of this is picking up on international comparisons, and a lot of the literature we're using is inevitably looking at Canada, the US, UK, and a number of European countries in particular that are further advanced in many ways than we are in looking at these kinds of issues. The mapping and measuring of research impacts is, I think, one of the take-home messages that this project leads to. It's becoming a very important issue for funding bodies. If you look at funding bodies in North America and Europe, there is an increasing preoccupation with the issue of how do we demonstrate that research is not just of high quality intrinsically, but valuable and relevant and helping us to deal with the big issues of the day. And the value proposition for the social sciences is often a harder task, and I think we need to pay a lot more attention to that. It's relatively straightforward in the commercial and technical and engineering kinds of areas, and medicinal, medical research and pharmaceutical drugs and so on and so on. In social sciences, the value propositions are a bit different, because not everyone is going to invent some kind of diagnostic test that changes the well-being of the next generation of families and school children. Though some people in this room are doing precisely that, and good luck to you. I'm a great supporter, but not everyone does that kind of social research. So we need to develop a more confident account of ourselves in order to deal with this quite difficult debate about research impacts and relevance. And it becomes a dilemma for the university incentive structures finally. How is this university and how are other universities going to take seriously recognition for impact and engagement? We do like to have our cake and eat it too. We do like to be a top 4 university on research. We do like to do extremely well on the ERA research quality, but we also need to take our broader social mission fairly seriously, and we do that, I think, through better engagement. So let's go to discussion, and thanks for your attention.